History as it happens, January 19th, 2023. The world without us?
The questions involved relate not merely to violations of specific provisions of particular treaties. They are questions of war and peace, of international law, and especially of principles of humanity.
That totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States.
Because we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression. The battle would be renewed in one country and then another country, bringing with it perhaps even larger and crueler conflict.
The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands.
American power as the linchpin to democracy, global capitalism, and world order. This became an axiom after the Second World War because of its absence after the First World War, when the U.S. retreated from European affairs only to send its armies back to Europe a generation later. And it's the argument for supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression today, that the U.S. has to take the lead in shaping the international environment, of enforcing the so-called rules, because there can't be a world without us. That's next with Robert Kagan as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a contest with autocrats, autocratic governments around the world, as to whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century.
It's 1937, and the U.S. is still mired in the Great Depression. The so-called Roosevelt recession sends unemployment shooting toward 20%. Although Americans were primarily concerned with the economic disaster, and leaders in Congress were adamantly opposed to doing anything about the worsening international scene, FDR began preparing the people for the day when they could no longer hide from the world's problems. He delivered his quarantine speech in Chicago, October 5th, 1937.
When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease.
So Google Roosevelt quarantine speech and check it out. You'll see he mentions the bandit nations. That would be Nazi Germany, and Japan, which had just invaded Manchuria again, and Italy, a couple years before, invaded Ethiopia. 2 years later, with the situation far worse, Germany had just invaded Poland and Europe was at war again. On September 3, 1939, in his 14th fireside chat, Roosevelt again told Americans that while no man or woman should thoughtlessly or falsely talk of sending our armies to Europe, the country's interests were at stake nonetheless.
When peace has been broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. It is easy for you and for me to shrug our shoulders and say that conflicts taking place thousands of miles from the continental United States, and indeed thousands of miles from the whole American hemisphere, do not seriously affect the Americas, and that all the United States has to do is to ignore them and go about its own business. Passionately though we may desire detachment, we are forced to realize that every word that comes through the air, every ship that sails the sea, every battle that is fought, does affect the American future.
So maybe it's strange hearing a U.S. president trying to convince ordinary Americans that what happens on other continents affects their lives, and they may have to do something about it too. Unless you were born, 100 years ago, you wouldn't remember an era when overseas intervention was anathema, outside the Western Hemisphere anyway. But since 1945, it's been an axiom that the U.S. must lead the free world, and in certain cases, intervene in the affairs of other countries if our interests, safety, credibility, or the fate of the liberal world order was in jeopardy. July 28, 1965, Lyndon Johnson delivers his Why Are We in Vietnam speech.
An Asia so threatened by communist domination would certainly imperil the security of the United States itself. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else. Nor would surrender in Vietnam bring peace, because we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression.
That axiom I mentioned was never universally embraced, of course, and after Vietnam it receded some, but never disappeared. Just about every U.S. president has found himself explaining why the U.S. must lead or intervene when and where it wasn't obvious. Here is Bill Clinton in 1999 during the Kosovo intervention.
It's easy, for example, to say that we really have no interest in who lives in this or that valley in Bosnia, or who owns a strip of brushland in the Horn of Africa, or some piece of parched earth by the Jordan River. But the true measure of our interests lies not in how small or distant these places are, or in whether we have trouble pronouncing their names. The question we must ask is, what are the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread? We cannot, indeed we should not, do everything or be everywhere. But where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so. And we must remember that the real challenge of foreign policy is to deal with problems before they harm our national interests.
Well, that sounds a little like FDR from the late 1930s, although Roosevelt had to be really careful about saying something like that in public. Which is why he continued to promise Americans he wanted no war in Europe, while taking actions to prepare the country for a war he knew it could not ultimately avoid. These issues are at the heart of historian and Brookings Institution senior fellow Robert Kagan's new book, The Ghost at the Feast, America and Collapse of World Order, 1900 to 1941. After reluctantly getting involved in the First World War in 1917, 3 years after it began, really it wasn't until 1918 when large numbers of U.S. troops were available in Europe, the U.S. retreated behind its oceans, refusing to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or to join the League of Nations. And the result of this absence of U.S. leadership was the disintegration of democracy, the rise of dictatorships and national rivalries, and an end to the fragile peace that held together the interwar period in Europe. And the lesson, as Kagan put it in a recent essay about U.S. support for Ukraine, but might apply to a century ago too, only American power can keep the natural forces of history at bay. So this book challenged a lot of what I believed about the U.S. role in Europe after 1919 and the causes of the Second World War. It forced me to sharpen my thinking. I read all the endnotes to see where the author grounded his arguments, and I consulted a half-dozen books on my own shelf to get ready for this interview. Books about World War I, interwar diplomacy, Hitler, economics. This history matters. The indispensable role Robert Kagan believes the U.S. has in maintaining world order matters as much today as it did in the 1920s. Without this idea, would the U.S. be spending billions of dollars to help Ukraine fight the Russians or vowing to defend Taiwan against China? Robert Kagan, it is an honor to have you. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
As I read your book and your superb endnotes as well, to all the listeners, when you read Mr. Kagan's book, please consult the endnotes as you are reading it. They are essential. But as I read your book, I also read an essay you wrote in Foreign Affairs about what's going on in Ukraine today. The very final sentence of that article was, "Only American power can keep the natural forces of history at bay." That seemed to be the thesis of your book. Am I right about that?
Well, yeah, I guess so. In a very inadequate nutshell, yeah. Sure.
Yeah, well, go on. What was your argument of your book? That it was the United States' failure to engage with the world that led to the descent into a second war, right?
Yeah, right. Although actually, I think I'm going even one step further than that. And I'm sort of curious. I'm waiting for people to sort of respond to it, because it's pretty standard to say the United States' absence played a huge role in not preventing the rise of these dangerous regimes. But I would go even further and say that in the 1920s, there were significant policies that the United States both did undertake and also refused to undertake, which actually helped along the process of the disintegration of German politics and its radicalization, which actually helped along the Japanese turn from what had been a very serious experiment in liberal democracy away from that. So it wasn't only that the United States wasn't doing anything. The United States, after World War I, as today, is too powerful not to have an effect on the actions of other actors, whether the United States acts or not. Too many other peoples around the world are dependent on America's, the economy, the access to the American market, access to American goods and financing in this period. If you look at the way the Europeans were behaving, everyone in Europe after World War I, on both sides, I mean, from Germany and France to Britain, were all hoping for a greater American role, and Americans refused to play that role. There was also the question of war debts, which was a big fixation of the United States. The American insistence on collecting its war debts plus interest after World War I helped drive Germany into the disastrous depression and inflation of the 1920s and encouraged violence between France and Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to make it clear, it isn't just the passivity that was a problem. There were active policies the United States undertook, which also deranged the international system at that time.
Herbert Hoover made a similar argument to that as to how the Great Depression came about. He wasn't entirely wrong, blaming it on international factors. We'll return to the Depression in a little bit. But when you talk about American power today versus the immediate post-war period, talking World War I, American power in those days was not military, though. There was always a potential for it, as was witnessed during the Great War. But what was American power then in those early days that you say was indispensable to trying to maintain, and of course all this is truly unknowable in the final analysis, right? We're talking about a counter-historical here. But what was the impact or the potential impact of that American power in Europe?
And I agree with you. It is counterfactual history to discuss, what might have happened. On the other hand, I do want to emphasize that in the book, and if you read the section carefully, you'll see that there are many, many American officials, not to mention European officials at the time, who were warning precisely about what was going to happen. It wasn't as if no one was saying it. So it is counterfactual, but it's a different course that people were recommending at the time for this exact reason. But the key thing to remember about World War I, and anyone versed in the literature of European politics in that time knows that the standard view is that the Versailles Treaty was fatally flawed. It was either too hard or too soft, or both too hard and too soft on Germany. And I think most people blame the breakdown of European order in part on the Versailles Treaty's failings. But in fact, the Versailles Treaty was never supposed to operate without the United States as a central figure. The treaty was built around American power. For instance, there was going to be an American representative as chairman of the Reparations Commission, which was a critical commission that was going to decide how much Germany had to pay in war reparations. Americans didn't play that role. All countries were dependent on American financing at that time and could not survive without American financing, which gave the United States enormous leverage over what everyone did. And although it was true the United States, but certainly before World War I, was not a major military power, in fact, the United States had practically no army to speak of before World War I. By the end of World War I, the United States had roughly 4 million troops under arms, 2 million of them in Europe. And even after the United States withdrew, there were several thousand troops still left in the Rhineland to preserve security. And it was the eventual decision by the United States to remove those troops in 1923 that made possible the French invasion of the Ruhr in that year, which is what really began the descent of Germany into the radicalization of a later period. So the United States wielded influence on all major fronts, political, economic, and military, greater than any influence it's ever wielded since, including after World War II. The United States has never had a more permissive environment if you wanted to create a relatively peaceful liberal order, with the United States playing a role as sort of the key to the whole thing.
But the way the First World War ended and the outcome, when you consider that, it's understandable why Americans turned away from what was going on in Europe. With reason, they saw the outcome of World War I as not very beneficial to the United States. Now, I think you do make a convincing argument in your book that had Germany won, and it was the U.S. involvement that finally did tilt the scales, right? Tip the scales for the associated powers to win the war. But Americans were turned off by the distribution of the colonial spoils after the war. I mean, they were correct to see that this simply reshuffled the colonial deck. What did we gain from this conflict in which 100,000 Americans were killed?
Well, you're right. It wasn't so much what America gained. It was really what America prevented. And the American public was overwhelmingly, by April of 1917, convinced that Germany was a very dangerous actor on the international scene. It was conquering all of Europe. It was very much an ideological struggle, which I think has been lost by historians over the years. This was perceived on both sides. I want to emphasize that. On both sides, there was a perception that this was a grand ideological struggle between what Germans referred to as their particular Kultur, with a K, but which meant to them basically the elevation of the state as the primary actor and the subordination of individuals to the state. They were proud of having that kind of system, and they looked on liberalism, especially liberalism in Britain, as essentially weak, essentially selfish, mostly about greed and people taking care of their own interests. And they really felt that their approach to human affairs was superior. So it really was an ideological struggle. And I think that's what convinced Americans that they needed to be involved. Now, at the time, of course, Germany was very close to conquering all of Europe, as Hitler ultimately did as well. And Americans thought that would not be in their interest for all the democracies of Europe, such as they were, and France and Britain primarily, to be overthrown by this German militarist government. Now, as it happens, once the danger has passed and been defeated, it's fairly normal for a country to say, well, okay, that's taken care of, and now we should go home. But this buildup of hostility to the Europeans, because they were, especially Britain and France, because they were both obviously colonial powers, they're imperial powers, and they were carving up the remains of the Ottoman Empire at the end, and there was a lot of trading of Chinese territory back and forth as a result of the conflict. So Americans were put out by that. But Americans also were fully aware that Britain and France were colonial powers when they fully supported them as well. Americans didn't just wake up to discover that these were colonial powers. And so I think that the argument that the war was a disaster because it wound up helping two colonial powers, France and Britain, and therefore the United States had been engaged in some dirty business. This was a kind of after the fact. This was part of the political argument, and I want to emphasize this. The battle over the League of Nations was a political battle primarily. It was primarily a battle between Republicans seeking to regain office in 1920 and Democrats trying to hold on to the White House at that time. And so a lot of the arguments that one heard at the time were pretty much pulled out in order to make the case, in order to defeat the treaty. What I find ironic is that those political arguments settled into history as actual arguments, as if the main reason that Americans were pulling away from the League and the treaty was because of European colonialism. And I just think that's nonsense. And that's an ex post facto, retroactive critique of the war based, coming from a certain political and ideological perspective.
Well, as you know, critics of your argument have made a similar argument, but from the other end, that this ideological struggle against liberalism or autocracy versus democracy, we hear that today, was something that the propagandists were saying in order to elevate the struggle in the minds of Americans to win their support. I mean, a lot of work had to go in to getting consent for the war in the United States. I mean, there was a harsh crackdown on all anti-war dissent because I think Americans were right to see the war as a mistake. You say it's not pointless in the book, and I agree it wasn't pointless. Although the combat was existentially pointless, as John Kagan once said. But the war was unnecessary. I know that wasn't much of a question, more of a thought salad there, but you can pick that apart any way you wish.
I don't know why you would say the war was unnecessary. The problem we have with history in general, and I know you're acutely aware of this, is that we live history forward, but we judge it backward. And the reason World War I seems hopeless is because the peace failed and we had World War II. If the peace had succeeded and there had not been World War II, which was avoidable, by the way, we would not have decided that World War I was fruitless. So I think a lot of this is, again, a jumbling of our historical memory. But this does get to a crucial question, and it's a question that pervades American foreign policy, and it is a question that pervades our decision-making today, which is what is necessary? Was it absolutely necessary for the United States security, the security of the American homeland, to go to war in Europe in World War I? The answer is no. American security was not threatened. No one was planning an invasion of the United States, nor was anyone capable of conducting an invasion of the United States. What made it quote unquote necessary, if it was necessary, was the idea that Americans did not want to live in a world that was dominated by militarist autocracies in Europe and Asia. And ultimately, that was something that Americans fought against twice in the 20th century. And for those who want to say that it wasn't necessary, I think it's important for them to explain then why in the world did Americans regard it as necessary. By the way, most people think World War II was quote unquote necessary. It also wasn't necessary. I think it's pretty clear looking at, I know this is a discussion that historians have had, but I think it's pretty clear looking at Hitler's thinking during this period. He had no plans for an invasion of the United States, not soon and possibly not ever. Similarly, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was primarily a defensive action. It was not intended as a preview to or prelude to an invasion of the United States. So the United States, in my view, has never fought a war that was quote unquote necessary. And in fact, I'm not sure any war is actually quote unquote necessary, even for countries not like the United States. But certainly when Americans have gone to war, it has been for a larger set of reasons that if you agree with it, it's an enlightened sense of self-interest that is not simply about material and immediate security, but about larger questions of world order. And if you disagree with it, then you think Americans are going to war for moral and ideological reasons that are not related to security. That is the big argument that we've been having as a nation and are having even today, right now, on the question of Ukraine.
One of the more convincing aspects of your book is this argument about what constitutes national interest and how the United States, how the U.S. government was able to convince the people that in the long term, their security would be at risk. It was about the kind of world that would have prevailed had the United States not gotten involved in both wars. Maybe we'll return to that in a bit. I want to go back to your earlier point about second-guessing history and what if the United States had played the role that it could have in the interwar period. I think you're right. You weren't doing second-guessing. You were pointing to people who were first-guessing. Because there's always a choice, right? There were decisions that were made. These weren't inevitable outcomes. But I'll just cite something here from Zara Steiner's brilliant book, The Lights That Failed, a gigantic book about the 1920s. She says the basic problem with the Versailles settlement was structural. It could not adequately address the fundamental gap between the French and German power positions. There was a basic conflict between French security and German recovery, which the treaty could not solve. Any substantive revision of the treaty's terms in the German direction meant a loss of security for France. How could the United States have solved that problem?
Well, in the same way that it solved the almost identical problem after World War II. I mean, after all, NATO was partly about dealing with the Soviet Union, but it also aimed to solve precisely this problem, which was how can the rest of Europe allow Germany to grow again, to become an economic powerhouse again, which, by the way, Europe needs. Germany was, at least from the late 19th century onward, the engine of the overall European economy. And so the question is, how could Germany go back to that role without its neighbors having to fear that its economic power would once again be translated into military power and they would once again be facing a German invasion, which, from the French point of view, it was a reasonable fear since they'd been invaded by Germany 3 times in 1870 and 1914 and then again in 1940. So that was always the problem. But the Versailles Treaty, in attempting to address that problem, again, relied critically on the United States precisely to fill that gap. It was true that if you just left Germany and France to their own devices, they were in an insoluble dilemma. It was, in fact, the case that any strengthening of Germany wasn't going to imperil French security. Therefore, the French didn't want Germany to be strengthened. Therefore, the French wanted Germany to be essentially crushed economically, which helped lead to the radicalization of Germany. The French actually hoped that Germany would be torn to pieces. They wanted to divide Germany. That was their original position going into the Paris talks in 1919. Their goal was to break Germany up, and Wilson had to work very hard, along with Lloyd George, of Britain to try to prevent that from happening, because they didn't think that was in anybody's interest. That was just the recipe for the next war. You know, Zarstein is the finest historian of this period that there is. I use her work extensively, as you'll see from the footnotes. But I think this has been a lacuna in especially Europeans talking about the Versailles settlement, is not to see what everyone at the time understood was true, which was that the United States was the long pole in the tent. The United States' presence in Versailles, the United States' physical presence in the Rhineland, was the guarantee that the French wanted and needed. And to say that the United States couldn't have played that role, I think is sort of defied by the fact that the United States did ultimately play that role after a much greater war and at much greater costs, actually, unfortunately.
You argue in the conclusion of your book that the United States should have kept an occupying force in Europe, and just a few thousand troops would have been able to manage the situation. No one was calling for that, though, at the time, were they?
That's not true. Okay. I'm sorry. And that's really what I worked hard to try to excavate, actually. I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you. No. I mean, if no one had said that in the time, then I wouldn't have tried to make this. I wouldn't have made the argument that it was possible. But it was precisely because, much to my surprise, I guess, I found American ambassadors in Berlin and in Paris and in London writing consistently and repeatedly to back home, saying if the United States did not keep a few thousand troops in Europe, everything would fall apart. And we had an incredibly skillful general who was the commander. He was a diplomat general of the First Order. His name was Henry T. Allen, who was in charge of those forces in the Rhineland. And even without any instructions, he spent most of his time adjudicating disputes between Germans and French and basically keeping everybody on an even keel. And it was well understood at the time that the American role, even with a very small military presence, was to a large extent the glue that was holding everything together. Those troops are withdrawn in 1923, and really that is the beginning of Germany's sort of angry rebellion against the Versailles Agreement, which ultimately leads to revision of the Versailles Agreement, which ultimately leads to World War II.
I'm with Margaret Macmillan when it comes to the impact of the Versailles Treaty on 1939. She says we can't draw a straight line from 1919 to 1939. A lot happened between those two dates. A lot happened after 1923, after withdrawal of U.S. troops, namely the Great Depression. And in the end, how punitive was the Versailles Treaty to Germany? Because the Germans didn't pay the reparations. The United States floated loans to the Germans, who then used that money to pay the British and the French, who then used that money to pay their debts to the United States. And there was actually a period of stability in the mid to late 1920s, where if we look at the 1920s as a post-war period rather than a pre-war period, might challenge your thesis there.
That's the standard account. The standard account is that Americans played a fairly judicious role in not playing any role in Europe other than an economic role. That America used its economic tools, and famously with the Dawes Plan, which is what you're referring to, of 1924, which was then, with some American pressure, led to the Locarno Agreements of 1925 between France and Germany. By 1928, you've got the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is it's meaningless, and the people who constructed it intended it to be meaningless, but nevertheless, you have a tremendous amount of optimism at that time. So there's no question that people were certainly under the impression at that time things had stabilized. But if you look into that period carefully, as I've tried to do, you can see that the stability was an illusion. The Dawes Plan as an economic solution was an illusion. And again, there were people who said it, who pointed this out at the time. John Maynard Keynes said quite rightly that all that had been done, you described it yourself just now, was the creation of a circular flow of paper. Nothing changed. It did not lead to an improvement in German economic capability. It did not lead to a reduction of the German budget deficit, for instance, which was a big problem. It was simply that, as you say, the lenders lent the money, the Germans took the money, the Germans paid the money to the French and the British, and the money then wound back up in the hands of the U.S. taxpayer. It was a very nice solution for the U.S. taxpayer, but it was not, in fact, a solution for Europe. I agree entirely. 1919 did not lead to 1939. It was the failure to fulfill the Versailles Treaty, and above all, it was the decision of the United States not to play the role that the authors of the Versailles Agreement had intended it to play. That's been too much of a missing gap, I think, even for a historian as terrific as Steiner. And I think that's because she assumed with good reason that there was no way in the world the Americans were going to play that role. So it was unrealistic to imagine. To build a treaty around the Americans was foolish in retrospect, right? And of course, it was even worrisome at the time. I mean, the title of my book is The Ghost at the Feast. That line comes from a memoir written by Harold Dickinson, who was a great British diplomat at the time, who was at the Paris talks in 1919, and he wrote that the prospect, I'm paraphrasing, the prospect that the Americans would not make good on anything they committed to was the ghost at all our feasts. And I think it's worth remembering how much those people understood at the time that if the United States did not play its role as envisioned in the Versailles Treaty, then the treaty would not work.
Let's just say the United States did join the League of Nations and did ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The Great Depression still happens, maybe not in the exact same way. Let me ask you, my sense from reading your book was that you downplay the importance, compared to other scholars, of the Great Depression in turning the illusory, well, even grant you that point, stability of the 1920s into a disaster. Am I right about that you don't see the Great Depression as important as, say, a Steiner does?
Obviously, the Great Depression was incredibly important, and it was particularly important in determining American policy in the 1930s. The reason I don't want it to be treated as the hinge, there is a tendency to suggest that things were going roughly okay, and then this deus ex machina of the Great Depression came in and destroyed everything. This is a good explanation if you want to absolve everyone of responsibility, unless you want to find responsibility for who's responsible for the Great Depression, which, by the way, is arguably the United States. In any case, what I found, however, and I think others, I certainly didn't discover this myself, is that the German disaster precedes the Great Depression. In fact, the worst thing that happened to the Germans was the American stock boom in the late 1920s, because it actually led to decreased American private lending to Germany, because everyone in the world wanted to get their money into the U.S. stock market during that period. So a lot of lending dried up to Germany. And then it was also American policy to put an end to the Dawes Plan sort of subsidization and try to make Germany independent. So roughly speaking, and even before the Great Depression hits, Germany is sinking into difficult, very dangerous economic times because of the drying up of foreign loans. Then there is the action that the Germans undertake. The new Brüning government tries to engage in a customs union with Austria, which is perceived as a step in the direction of violating the Versailles Agreement, because Versailles forbade union between Germany and Austria. And I think that the evidence suggests that French lenders pulled money out of an Austrian bank, the Credit Anstalt, which was the bank that failed, that ultimately kicked off the chain reaction, which ultimately helped produce the Great Depression, in addition to the American stock crash. So it's just a complicated story, and I don't want to let us all off the hook by saying everything was fine and then the Great Depression happened. That's simply not what happened. There were a lot of decisions and actions made, and some of which contributed to the Great Depression, which then had the effect on the rest of the world.
I mean, the effect of the Great Depression was it made countries turn inward, and it made international cooperation less attractive, in some cases impossible. For instance, the United States was in no position. I mean, we've got to talk about capabilities here, not just what might have happened had there been the desire to intervene more heartily in European affairs. Capability is important, too. The United States was really in no position to help out Europe in the 1930s during the depths of the Great Depression. Do you agree with that?
No.
Okay.
I mean, the United States obviously was suffering from the effects of the Great Depression, but it still had enormous amounts of financial capacity compared to the rest of Europe. But also the Europeans at that moment weren't looking for financial problems. Hoover, after resisting cutting back on the debt payments to the United States from the Europeans, finally called for a moratorium on the debt payment. And ultimately, the European powers agreed that they just simply weren't going to pay the debts anymore. So that issue became moot. And then it became, in the 30s, it became very much a security question. And the real issue for the United States then, and the issue was that the Europeans were preoccupied by, were if, and this is an issue that began in the 20s as well, but if, for instance, let's say Germany became aggressive again, would the United States even take part in a League of Nations sanctioning of Germany. That was a real question. And of course, ultimately, the American Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, which forbade the United States to participate in any kind of international sanction against a belligerent. It basically imposed a kind of neutrality that was even more draconian than traditional neutrality. Yes, there was a Great Depression. It had the effect that it had. By the way, the Great Depression did not convince nations to start looking inward. Nations were already looking inward, in part, hence the Great Depression.
Yes.
You know, you had a very much beggar thy neighbor approach to international economics at that point, especially in the United States, where pressures for high tariffs began immediately after World War I. They didn't wait for the Depression. So again, I'm not trying to minimize the significance of the Depression. It was very important, but I don't want it to be the catch-all excuse for why it was okay that the United States conducted what I regard as fairly irresponsible policies throughout both of those decades, which had an enormous impact on the decisions that other nations took.
But the most important development of all in this very complicated picture, and I know we've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but I like rabbit holes. And
Good rabbit hole.
And I promise to bring it back up to 30,000 feet so we can see why all this still matters today. But the most important development of all here had more to do with what was going on inside Germany, its domestic politics, as well as the tumult caused by the Great Depression, and that is the fall of the Weimar Republic and then the eventual rise of Hitler. That's about a 3-year span that takes, if you date the beginning of the end of the Weimar Republic to Bruning's appointment as chancellor in 1930. And one of the provocative arguments in your book was that Hindenburg's decision to reluctantly appoint Hitler at the beginning of 1933 had everything to do with American decisions made and not made in the previous years. And my reaction to that was to go fetch my books off my shelf and to try to sharpen my thinking about this. But isn't that ultimately guesswork?
I mean, history is always to some extent guesswork. But actually, in this case, I think you could make a pretty good case. And again, it's not necessarily even my case. You refer to Adam Tooze, and he writes about this period that there was nothing inevitable about Hitler's coming to power. And there certainly was nothing inevitable about Hitler coming to power when he did. And the timing is all very critical. I make a very big point in the book. And this gets to your point in general, because I think by saying, weren't there things happening in Germany, the implication is, the finish the sentence would be that we're out of our control.
Yes.
And therefore, it's sort of silly to try to cast some responsibility on anybody other than the German people for the crisis that they fell into. But in my view, the reality is quite different. First of all, no country is an island unto itself, to quote Dunn. All countries are influenced by external factors. And Germany, after World War I, was essentially an occupied power. They were not in control of their own sovereignty. They did not control their own territory. There were foreign troops in their territory. And the Dawes Plan put basically American and British bankers in charge of the German economy. So for us to stand by and say, hey, boy, they really messed up, but nothing we could do, we were all over there. We were inside their government. The international community controlled the German railroad system, for instance, as collateral for the loan. So to absolve anyone of responsibility outside of Germany seems to me to be foolish.
Well, I agree with you on that point, but what about Hitler in January 1933? I see that as more driven by domestic politics, more so, not entirely, but more so than indirect consequences of American foreign policy.
No, I agree, but what drove the domestic politics? And the number one issue in domestic politics in Germany was reparations from the beginning, right? I mean, every government had to deal with the question of reparations. The German people, not surprisingly, were not eager to send all the money they earned into the coffers of other countries. And by the way, the debt that the Germans owed was going to continue to be paid until 1988. And you can imagine what the psychological effect of that was on the average German people. You mentioned earlier, by the way, and this is another thing that I think, as you know, it's a huge dispute among historians, was could the Germans have paid the reparations? Because, you know, much of the crisis in the early 20s, which leads to a lot of radicalization, stems from the fact that the Germans claim that they can't, and the French come in and punish them, et cetera, et cetera. Historians have sort of demonstrated, economic historians, that they could have paid. The Germans could have paid the reparations. But I think if you put yourself in the position of German politicians in that period, in order to pay reparations, the Germans would have had to live in extreme austerity. They would have had to put up with tremendous economic deprivation, all for the purpose of being able to ship whatever money they had to other countries. Now, Germany was a democracy after World War I, and you can imagine that in a democracy, this would be a difficult sell, especially when people are hungry and losing their lifelong savings. And whatever they have, some portion of it is supposed to go to pay the victors in a war of which you are the loser. It's not a very popular position. So that, I think, to say the Germans could pay the reparations does not take the political issues seriously enough. So that was weighing on them. The fact that they were occupied was weighing on them. And the Hindenburg decision, I think the point I'm trying to make, but which also I think Adam Tooze would also support, is that if the troops were still in the Rhineland, this is the key thing, if at the time that Hindenburg made his decision, the troops had been recently withdrawn, if the troops were still in the Rhineland, if French power still controlled part of the Rhineland, Hindenburg would not have made that decision. And this is something that the German scholars have pointed out. What the right, quote unquote, the right in Germany was willing to do was limited by their perception of how the French and the English and the Americans would respond, because they had so much leverage over German life. So it was only when that leverage went away that the Germans decided they could go in this direction and basically overthrow the democracy. As long as they were beholden, as long as there were troops on their territory, as long as they couldn't pay, as long as they were dependent on foreign financing, they had to sort of obey the liberal rules. But as soon as they were no longer under that kind of pressure, they went in that direction. And I think you can't deal with domestic politics in Germany without understanding the international environment that they were operating in.
But Hitler's rivals for the chancellorship were also hell-bent on getting rid of Weimar democracy. It was that Schleicher, or Schleicher, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, former general, von Papen. Hindenburg chose Hitler reluctantly because of an impasse between those other competing factions, and also because they weren't that afraid of Hitler, which seems crazy to think of today. They thought they could control him. The other choices that were available to Hindenburg would have brought about the end of, it wasn't a question of whether they were going to uphold Weimar democracy.
This is a great detail for your listeners. I hope they're into it. If they're interested, they can go read all the different books on this subject. But the decision to name Brüning
that's 1930.
Right.
That's 1930.
Which was again an optional choice, and that was sort of pre-Hindenburg. But that, as was understood at the time by American observers, to have been a big problem and a real harbinger of the fall of Weimar, which would have said, okay, if we didn't want Weimar to fall, then that would have been a good moment to sort of step in and get involved. 1930, it was sort of pre the effects of depression. Certainly the crash had not quite had its effect. And it was still the policy of America. Let's not forget, these were not careful, calculated, what's on our strategic interest. Let me think hard about how much of an interest we have in Europe. That was not the way decisions were being made about this in the United States at that time. There was a very determined, I would say, extreme faction that had taken control of the Republican Party, which wanted nothing to do with Europe, period, and stop. It wasn't, if we maybe should do a little of this and a little of that. It was nothing. They were so opposed to the League of Nations. They were so opposed to involvement in Europe that when American diplomats wanted to go overseas to do some kind of negotiation with Europeans, they had to go in their private capacity. They couldn't go as officials. They had to go pretend that we're going to London to see their Savile Row tailors. They couldn't go as American officials. That's how absurd our position was at that time. So it would be one thing if I thought that Americans had very carefully considered exactly what role they wanted to play in Europe, but that was not what was happening. Anything having to do with Europe was verboten. That did not make for intelligent policymaking.
It bordered on irrational. Many of the citations in your book and the quotes from senators, newspaper editors, peace activists, you name it, just an antipathy to everything European. So I think you are right about that. They weren't actually having a policy debate, although these policy debates become a little bit more specific in the late 1930s after Roosevelt starts preparing the country. So I think maybe there's the sea change, right? Roosevelt saw that it was impossible for the United States to stay out of what was happening, even if that didn't mean sending an army to Europe again.
Right.
He understood that the United States had to get involved in what was happening because of what would happen to the world climate, right? Could the United States thrive and survive in a world that was run by autocratic regimes?
Right. And, that shift is not just because Roosevelt takes office, because after all, Roosevelt in his first term, although he personally is how the internationalist bent, he's as much of an isolationist as anybody could possibly want in his first term in the 1930s, because he's focusing on the Depression. He's not bucking on foreign policy. And what changes really is not so much Roosevelt, but just the mounting events, dear boy, as the British once said, I can't remember his name right now. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the Anschluss with Austria in 1937, then of course Munich in 1938. And so by that time, it's not hard to picture what the future holds. And then there is as you say, then there is a real debate. Okay, we agree things are going in a very bad direction in Europe and now in Asia, especially after the Chinese intervention in Manchuria. What are we going to do about it? And then you had a big debate. 1920s was not really a big debate about American foreign policy. 1930s was, because events presented themselves in such a way that decisions had to be made.
Well, it is the mark of a good book when it challenges, in my case, challenges what I had believed to be the case based on my previous readings and why I had to go to my shelf and enlist a forklift to bring these gigantic books with me to this. Zara Steiner's 2 volumes are over 2,200, 2,300 pages. I have Ian Kershaw's Hitler biography here. That's more than 2,000 pages. I think I pulled this one off the shelf because I wanted to check up on your claim that, and this is really not that important to the overall discussion, that Hitler sped up the preparation for Operation Barbarossa because he was worried about the United States entering the war. Before we go big picture again, we'll touch on one more rabbit hole point. I didn't find this one convincing at first either. Like I said, I did some checking on it. Not that I'm a historian. I'm just a journalist who hosts a podcast. But you did mention some other factors there that drove the timeline for Barbarossa. The weather, right, number one, and also what was going on in the Balkans and Greece, too. Actually delayed the start of Barbarossa.
I was trying to understand from my own understanding, what was Hitler thinking about the United States? And it's not an easy answer. There's not an easy answer to that, because I think Hitler changed his mind a lot. It depended on circumstances. This is true about every action he took. He would think he was going to do something and then decide he wasn't going to do it. He was very opportunistic.
This is a hotly contested subject now among historians. Just to what extent was Hitler preoccupied with the United States?
Right. Now, and I think the simple answer is it waxed and it waned, depending on circumstances. If you want to look at the issue writ large, Hitler certainly knew after World War I and living through the 1920s that the United States was capable of playing an enormous role in shaping Germany's future. And in the 1920s, he actually feared the United States would be the great competitor to what he was trying to accomplish in Germany. Why? Because when the Congress passed the draconian anti-immigration legislation of 1924, Hitler read that as, oh my gosh, the Americans are going to become the Aryan nation because the only immigrants they're accepting are from Northern Europe. And he was very much upset. His historical impression was that so many Germans had moved to America because it was a huge German population in America. On the one hand, he hoped that they would ultimately be loyal to Germany, but on the other hand, what he feared was that they'd been converted. So he had a special problem with America, but he was also capable of being convinced, as he was convinced ultimately about the French and the British, that the Americans were paper tigers, that the Americans had no interest in fighting, that the Americans were not going to stand in his way. That was a perfectly reasonable judgment to make in the 1930s because A, we didn't have the military capacity to deal with him and weren't trying to acquire it. And B, we had neutrality legislation and very prominent political figures saying we were never going to get involved in Europe no matter what was happening there. So his initial sort of general concern about America faded until in the late 1930s when Roosevelt starts pushing things toward a greater American, at least assistance to the Allies, and Hitler all of a sudden realizes that the Americans are playing the game. And then he begins to associate Roosevelt and the Americans in general with the global Jewish conspiracy. And that's a critical part of understanding Hitler's mentality. He sort of had the admiration for the British, and I think a certain kind of admiration for the Americans, and until he decided that in fact Roosevelt was being run by the Jews, and that he was basically the head of Judaism International, and therefore America and Judaism became synonymous. So some aspect of the Holocaust, he makes it very clear, is an effort to punish the Jews and to send a signal to Jewish America. This is what was going to happen to your people. And so it's hard for me not to think that he's preoccupied with the United States. When it gets down to military tactics, it is only preoccupation with the United States, it seems to me, that can explain why he declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor. He was so desperate to get the Japanese into the war, to distract the Americans in the East, to keep them off his back in the Atlantic. He promised the Japanese that if they entered the war, he would enter it too. And he ultimately made good on that. You know, we always think, well, what's the promise of Hitler worth? But in this case, he meant it because he was so worried that the Japanese would find an accommodation with the United States. So that is clear. I have read, I'm not an expert on Barbarossa, but I certainly have read historians who said that he hurried up his plans to go into the Soviet Union because he believed that time was no longer on his side as far as American involvement was concerned. There is a moment, I'll end with this, there is a moment at which he begins to panic about the possibility that the United States is going to enter the war in such a way that is bad for him.
And this issue is in 1939 as well. Adam Tooze has made this argument about why did Hitler finally decide to throw the dice and go to a real war rather than the so-called peaceful war he had been pursuing while he gobbled up Austria, Czechoslovakia, the Rhineland. You know, why did he throw the dice in 1939? Was it because of long-term fear, medium-term fear of the United States? I do think ultimately it's unknowable, but I agree that not only Hitler, the German military as well believed that time was not on their side. So how do you feel when you see the New York Times review your book and the headline for the review is, well, I'll paraphrase, basically, this is Robert Kagan being Robert Kagan. Well, here's the headline. Robert Kagan's case for U.S. empire. I mean, are you instrumentalizing history to make a point about the importance of the U.S. presence today? How do you respond to that?
There's a big argument going on about American foreign policy today. The reviewer of my book is on the other side of the argument. You know, he doesn't agree with my approach to the world, which is fine. And in fairness, I think he doesn't really review the book. He sort of reviews me. Again, that's the reviewer's prerogative. Look, as a historian, I think any historian who's honest will agree on the following things. One is that it's very hard not to go back into history without some preconceived notion of what you think things ought to be. All historians do that. To be a good historian means going beyond that and, in fact, being willing to let the facts push you in a different direction. And there are certainly, I worked on this book. I'm going to lie and say I worked on this book for 12 years, but it definitely is longer than that. So some of the argument that I hear, and which is sort of reflected in that review that you mentioned, is that there was some indication that somehow I wrote this in order to be ready for Ukraine.
That's not how books work, right?
Obviously, that's sort of absurd when you think about it. I do have a point of view. What I've tried to do in this book is amass serious historical evidence. If people want to challenge the evidence, I want to hear about it. I know there are different interpretations of this period, obviously. I've written my own interpretation of it. If the question is, do I believe the United States has a central role to play in keeping the world in a fundamentally liberal and peaceful direction, I plead guilty. I do believe that. The book bears reading even if you disagree with me, because I think that there's a lot of information in the book that will, even people who disagree with me, if they take it seriously, will have to reflect a little bit at least upon some of their assumptions. And that would be the extent of my goal. In fact, what you told me is very heartening. I have to say, if after reading my book, you went off and went back to your 15 other sources, yes. I'm glad. That's exactly what should happen. You know, this isn't about making an argument and having somebody yell at you back that they disagree with your argument. All right, let's dig into this stuff and take a look at it.
Well, you do make a formidable argument, and I have wanted to have you on the podcast for quite a while now because I do respect your mind and your work even when I disagree with it. So I want to go back to the very first thing I raised in our conversation before we wrap up here. You said only American power can keep the natural forces of history at bay. This was your recent piece, not your book, your recent piece in Foreign Affairs, but I thought about it as I read your book. You know, since the end of the Cold War, folks like Francis Fukuyama have said the natural forces of history were, well, moving in a certain direction, liberal democracy. Are the natural forces of history actually anti-democratic?
Well, even I need to be careful using a phrase like the natural forces of history.
I was wondering what you meant there.
You know, that's essay writing rather than history writing, and so I'll apologize for that. But I guess what I certainly mean by that is there's no reason to look at the entire span of human history and say that somehow liberalism is the winner. It's hard for people who are living in a certain kind of environment to understand that that environment is not necessarily the natural environment, that it was created by them, by those who agree with them. The liberal world order did not evolve naturally because it's the better idea, which is what Frank's argument is, and others have made that. Steven Pinker, it's sort of the triumph of the Enlightenment ideal. I think my argument is this way of looking at the world is historically extremely rare. There are no periods in history other than our own where the liberalism has been a dominant force. And I think that it's pretty clear that international orders depend for their existence on those capable of sustaining them and defeating alternative visions. And that is what has happened in this case since the rise of the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. That it's no accident that the most powerful country is a fundamentally liberal society, and that therefore the world has taken on a fundamentally more liberal cast. And if that country ceases to be or ceases to have the power to enforce it, then things will take what would be their natural course in the absence of such a power. And I think one of the things that seemed clear to me is that how can you look at the last century, in particular, the 20th century, but also how could you look even today and say things naturally tend toward liberalism and peace? It's pretty clear that if the United States had not been present and it had not acted in the first half of the 20th century, that the militaristic dictatorships would have had a much easier time of it and would probably be dominant forces in the world today. That was where World War I was heading. That's where World War II was heading. And I think today it remains the case that were there no United States, the natural course of events would be China would be hegemonic in its region. Russia would be hegemonic in Eastern Europe. They would have the kind of governments that they have, and the world would be a very different kind of a place. I don't consider this, people treat this like sometimes it's some kind of flag waving or I'm really proud to be an American, etc. It has nothing to do with that. These are sort of facts. These are realities. America has all this power. It has these views, and therefore those views tend to predominate. But they don't have to, and historically they haven't.
Robert Kagan, we thank you for a thought-provoking discussion. And I'm going to leave our listeners with some reading suggestions. I should really do this more often, but the book we discussed today, again, is The Ghost at the Feast. That is a second in a planned trilogy Robert Kagan is writing about U.S. foreign policy. Also, you may want to check out Adam Tooze, Tooze. He's written 2 books that are relevant here, The Deluge and The Wages of Destruction. David M. Kennedy's Over Here, which is about the First World War and American society. You might also want to read Zara Steiner's The Lights That Failed and the Triumph of the Dark. That is a 2-volume series on interwar Europe. As well as, I will get to the end of this list, I promise, as well as Ian Kershaw's Hitler biography, that is a 2-volume work, and Richard Evans' trilogy on the rise and fall of the Third Reich. I've read all of those books. Some of them are immense. I know no one really wants to be told to read a 1,000-page book, but take my word for it. It'll be worth it. Oh, also, Margaret Macmillan's Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World. That is about the Versailles Treaty. On the next episode of History as It Happens, some House Republicans are talking about a new church committee to investigate the investigators. Well, we're going to talk about the first church committee next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.